Hello and welcome to this session this afternoon. I'm not sure how many of you got to see the not very present Nick Clegg from what was once called Facebook, but I am delighted that we have in person, live in front of us, the great Roger McNamee. The impact of social media on news has been profound and not always positive, and one of the first people to start talking about that and to start saying that we need to do something about it was Roger McNamee, who also happens to be one of the earliest investors in Facebook. And in fact, Mark Zuckerberg called him a mentor in the early days. However, a few years ago, and we'll talk about the moment that this may have changed for Roger, he felt that things perhaps needed to change and talked to Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg, and ended up writing a book which was called Zucked, why we need to deal with the Facebook catastrophe. Roger, tell me, do you think it's even worse now than it was when you wrote that book?
Indisputably. So the challenge for all of us, and I think specifically for journalists and policymakers, is that Facebook is an extraordinarily useful product. It's a fun product. Other social platforms are also fun and also useful. And there is a tendency to get distracted by that and miss the business model and the issues that that business model creates for public health, for democracy, for privacy, and for the vitality of our economies. And what has happened, essentially, is that we've got a conflict of value systems. The United States, the United Kingdom, Portugal, are all countries that basically believe in democracy and believe in the right of self-determination, the right of each of us to make our own choices. That is the foundation of our society. Facebook, Google, and the other internet companies, their value system comes out of engineering. They believe in efficiency above everything else. And they believe in speed and scale as the way you measure efficiency. The problem is that when companies that are optimized for efficiency reach nation scale, as Facebook, Google, Amazon, and others have done, that value system of efficiency comes into conflict with the value systems of the countries in which they operate. In our case, democracy and the right of self-determination. And the problem is that democracy and self-determination are inefficient by design because they're designed to operate at human scale. And efficiency can go faster than that. And so it has an evolutionary advantage in this conflict. And the failure of journalists and policymakers to understand that this is in fact a competition between incompatible value systems has caused us to not act in the face of escalating harms. And we're now dealing in the United States with the worst response to the COVID pandemic of any developed nation, with the degradation of our democracy to minority rule, the undermining of the psychology of our teenagers, particularly teenage girls, and a million other things that are going wrong. And we're still asking the question, should we regulate these companies? And I would argue, and this is where we'll go, that we are at the same position today we were with food production and medicine in 1900 and with chemicals in the 1950s. We have an industry that is essential to our economy, but which cannot operate safely without regulation.
Roger, I want to come back to the role of the media and the news business. But firstly, you talk about regulation, and there has been not much take-up. Facebook itself has not seen this as a good idea, but regulators, politicians haven't. A couple of weeks ago, you wrote in Time magazine saying, this could be different this time. You have a feeling that things have changed. We're at a tipping point. Why? What's happened? What's different?
How many of you saw Frances Haugen last night? Okay, for those of you who didn't see it, get the film, watch it. So Frances Haugen changed everything. She was an employee at Facebook, worked in their civic integrity group, going up to and then after the US presidential election. She is an algorithm design expert. She brought out tens of thousands of pages of Facebook studies about the kind of problems that I've been discussing in the last few minutes. And essentially what she did was bring out evidence that Facebook was architected to do precisely what it has done. That in a world without regulation, executives are going to pursue any course of business that maximizes shareholder value. And in this case, maximizing shareholder value meant endangering public health, endangering democracy, undermining privacy, and undermining competition. And she brought out evidence that shows not only that this stuff was done on purpose, but that when warned of the consequences, management repeatedly chose to pursue the same business strategies. That creates pressure on politicians. They no longer have an excuse for inaction. It creates pressure on the judicial system in the United States because it turns out that Facebook in particular, but Google as well, have crossed lines and committed felonies. Felonies that require investigation. And all of these things are tools that really exist because the rule of law requires that if you're going to have laws, that people obey them, or if they don't obey them, that they be punished for that. And democracy depends on engagement of the people in their own interest. So effectively, I'm arguing that today we're testing both the rule of law. Will we, in fact, enforce the rule of law against these incredibly powerful corporations? And will we, in fact, stand up for democracy? Because in this conflict, if we do nothing, efficiency will win. And I don't think that's an outrageous statement any longer. When I said it a few years ago, people looked at me like, nah, that'll never happen. But look at the United States. We live under minority rule now. Our democracy is broken. You couldn't have had a worse response to COVID than we've had. And, you look at this and you go, this is not all Facebook's fault, right? There are a lot of other conditions that put us in that place, but Facebook has accelerated all of this and made it much, much, much harder to fix.
But is there the political will? Is there a national government, and the US and the UK with online harms, the US with no sort of really current plan that's working, is there enough will to do things quickly that will make a difference?
So in the US, I like to say in the United States, everything is impossible until it's inevitable, right? Things change very quickly. And 3 months ago, before Frances Haugen, honest to God, I'd been working in Washington at that point for more than 4 years, and it really looked intractable. But now I think there's real hope. And the key thing to understand is I do not favor unified approaches around the world. I do not think it's important for the EU to all get together. I don't think it's important for the EU and the US to get together. These companies automate everything, so the best possible outcome would be to have each individual country pick the aspect of this that bothers them most and to regulate it as forcefully as possible, because the sum of all those things together will result in a pretty good regulation around the world. Whereas we don't have the time to get everybody on the same page. That will dilute things in favor of the platforms too much.
So so the US, obviously the most important market for Facebook, we talked about it before, if it was a new FDA, it could be a federation for technology, what would it do?
So importantly, I believe we need to have regulation in 3 areas: safety, privacy, and competition. So when I speak about safety, I think if we think about this, what you realize is that the technology industry today, without any regulation at all, is producing an alarming number of products that are unsafe. Think about deep fakes. Are there really any commercially legitimate uses of deep fakes? How about facial recognition, right? let's think about, if you look around, there are a lot of things where there are obviously valid uses, but much of what goes on is still unsafe. Think about crypto, think about Facebook, think about YouTube. All of these things have very powerful, very valuable use cases, but in the absence of regulation, they've developed business practices that are dangerous. I'd like to have something that's like the Food and Drug Administration, that sets standards for safety for all technology products. So an AI would have to demonstrate that it is not bearing forward the biases of the real world, right? That real effort's been made to make things fair. And it's more than just transparency. These standards really have to be met in the real world. And so I'd like to see that. And that's the thing that in the United States we're just beginning to get people to focus on. On privacy, this is really about the business model of surveillance capitalism. Professor Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, makes the point that surveillance capitalism is a model of extracting data from the environment, from people, often without their permission, almost always without their knowledge. And what happens is you take those models and first you use machine learning to look for patterns in the whole population. You then create individual models for each person, and you compare it to the models you find where each person exists on the map of patterns in society to make predictions of future behavior, and then you use recommendation engines to manipulate their behavior. And this whole thing takes away self-determination from people. The problem with the metaverse is that it is a 360-degree manipulation of the people on the inside of it, right? It takes away their ability to make their own choices. And this is not to say you can't make virtual reality that is safe. Of course you can. But the business model of surveillance capitalism means that everything it touches is unsafe, and it now is going throughout the whole economy. Last week, 2 examples in my life. Tried to buy tickets for something. The ticket company would not sell me a ticket until I'd given them a cell phone number that they could verify. I go in to get a COVID test at a pop-up for-profit COVID center. They want my full medical history before they'll give me a COVID test. I say no. They say, we need your prescriptions. I say, you are not entitled to that. I had to escalate it up before I found somebody who agreed, yes, they are not legally allowed to ask me for that. But everybody wants to be a surveillance capitalist. That is not healthy. Shoshana believes surveillance capitalism is no different than child labor. It is taking away our human autonomy and should be banned.
Was this the problem with the news industry, Roger? Because the news industry for a long time, it's almost killed, obviously, parts of the news business, the business model for news. But actually, for a long time, what news organizations did was say, just give us more money, Facebook and Google. Is it too late for them? Is there something they can do to try to bring back?
So if you sit there and think about safety, privacy, the third one is competition. We just need to update the antitrust laws for the 21st century. So the reality of journalism is that journalistic organizations have basically just tried to extract money from internet platforms. That is insane. If the internet platforms are successful, there will not be a need for journalism, because in an authoritarian world, right, even if it's corporate authoritarianism, the choices are made by the authoritative figure. So journalism really doesn't have a place. You know, you can have things that are called newspapers that have like society and sports and things like that, but real journalism, that's something that you associate with democracies and open societies. But what we're talking about is something that is, it may be paternalistic, it may not be, it may not be a horrible place to live, but it'll be a place where increasingly AIs are making the choices for you. And they're not making them based on knowing your needs. They're based on looking at past patterns and saying, well, you fit this past pattern, so I'm going to make you do this. It's truly dystopian. And I think that journalistic organizations, and especially governments, need to wake up, because your interests are aligned with democracy, with self-determination. And the point here is, you don't have to accept anything I'm saying. What I'm asking you to do is engage in a thought experiment with me. Imagine for the purposes of the next 10 minutes of this session that what I'm saying is true. Just imagine this. It's a thought experiment. What would you do differently if I were correct?
Isn't that one of the problems that to date, lots of people, the US, UK, around the world have said, this is human behavior. Human behavior wants the ease of Facebook. They don't care about whether it's journalism. They don't care about what they're doing with their data. They just want something that's good for them. And human behavior doesn't want Big Brother. They don't want laws. What do you say to that?
So again, that is the proof point of the success of this model. So in surveillance capitalism, what you're doing is you have perfect information, and then you use behavioral economics, which is this understanding that human evolution, right, over the tens of thousands of years has not eradicated from our decision-making systems the instinct to run away from a saber-toothed tiger. Right? So we are basically the same in terms of our emotional responses, our ability to forecast the future, our tendency to focus on the most recent events, our tendency to focus on the positive or the negative without focusing on likelihood. Those things, behavioral economics suggests that humans are very predictable in their behavior. Now, if you use artificial intelligence and surveillance capitalism, you can figure out each one of you falls into which category, which tells them which parts of your personality they can manipulate. I would think if people understood that, then we could have a rational thing. And my whole point here is, I just want us to have an honest conversation about this culture, this value system war that's going on. So people can choose. Maybe you'd be happier under a world where Google and Facebook were making most of the choices. I can imagine that that would be, for a lot of people, a very happy place. It'd be entertaining, right? Presumably you'd be fed, you'd be clothed, you'd have a place to live. And maybe a lot of people don't mind that, right? In fact, maybe a majority. And that would be fine if that's how people voted. The problem is that we're not going to do this as the result of an actual decision. We're going to do this because a business model has evolutionary advantages and will outcompete the prevailing one. And if we don't engage in the conversation, if we don't insist that our governments go through this exercise, that's where we're going to wind up. And the reason Frances Haugen is so important is that she's forced the issue. People like me have been at this for years. We got a long way in raising awareness, but we didn't get very close to the answer. Now we're closer to the answer.
While we're working on regulations that would make a difference, would it help if, say, Mark Zuckerberg was held personally responsible for wrongdoing at Facebook? Or if the company were to be broken up? What would help as sort of something that could happen quickly?
My hypothesis here is that if you take out the big 5 tech companies from the Fortune 500, ask yourself the question, which of the other 495, how many of them are jealous of Mark Zuckerberg's success and power? Probably 495, right? How many of them, if they were CEO of Facebook, would behave differently than Mark? Probably 495, right? The reason is because in our economic system, CEOs, their only job is to maximize shareholder value, and it's hard to find a shareholder value maximizing strategy better than Mark's. Right? So in that sense, I don't blame Mark. But Mark did conceive of this, and Mark chose to ignore signals like Myanmar and Brexit, right? Things that could have told another person that maybe you want to slow down a little bit. I look at this in a very, very simple way, which is that we have faced this problem many times before of essential industries being out of control due to lack of regulation. It is the job of government to be the referee of capitalism. And this industry, just like the building trades at the time of the Great Fires, the railroads in the 19th century, food in 1900, pharmaceuticals in 1900, labor in the 30s, chemicals in the 1950s, this is an industry that's essential to the economy but out of control. And we have a choice. We can either bring it into control, which will unleash amazing growth. It'll be much better for startups, because a world that's fully monopolized is horrific for startups. I mean, if you like what you see today, wait until we regulate these guys, because there'll be 100 times the opportunities going forward. I think technology has an opportunity to be a force for good in society. And if it's not a force for good, that's our fault.
Do you think, though, Mark Zuckerberg or executives should be held legally responsible for the wrongdoing that, say, Francis and others have found evidence of?
I'm saying?
Do you think they should be found legally responsible for the wrongdoing that Francis and others, the Facebook files, sort of uncovered?
So the challenge legally for these companies. So let's look at Facebook. I think there are at least 6 areas where felony investigations are warranted. Francis Haugen's material shows 3 of them in particular. For the Securities and Exchange Commission, Facebook has clearly failed to properly disclose to investors what it knew about its business. There are cases where that is punishable by time in prison. Secondly, Facebook is clearly guilty of allowing human trafficking to take place on its platform with its full knowledge and being paid to enable it to happen. That is also a felony, also punishable by prison sentences for executives. Francis's material also shows how complicit Facebook's management team was in Stop the Steal, which led to the insurrection. Aiding and abetting an insurrection is a felony punishable by time in prison. There is an antitrust case where Google is being pursued by the state of Texas Attorney General for price fixing with Facebook in digital advertising. The standard penalty for that is 3.5 years in prison for all of the executives. And it is the clearest cut case of price fixing in the United States in decades. There are other cases. The point I'm trying to make here is if the rule of law is to mean anything, we have to enforce it. And the point is, I'm not rooting for people to go to jail, but I am rooting to give the government negotiating leverage for bringing about massive change. I want to see these investigations because the law matters. And if we're going to allow rich people to have a different set of laws than poor people or white people from black people, we're already doomed.
You've been a really successful investor for the 35 years. Do you regret investing in Facebook the way you did?
So it's a great question. So when I met Mark Zuckerberg, he was 22 years old. Facebook didn't even have news feed yet. No like button, nothing. It was brand new. I liked Facebook because there were 2 aspects of the product that I thought really made it amazing. One, authenticated identity, because you had to be a student with a school email address, so you knew who everybody was. That meant you'd be able to limit the impact of trolls on the platform. Secondly, he gave the user control of who could see their information, true privacy. And I told Mark the first time I met him that I thought because of those 2 things, he would create the first truly great social platform. And I thought he could get to 100 million people in English-speaking countries and be more valuable than Google. That's what I told him. I advised him for 3 years, because the problem was I first met him when the board was trying to sell the company to Yahoo. And he came to my office, and they didn't tell me why he was coming, but just that he had a huge problem. And I said, before he said a word, I said, Mark, you got to let me tell you why I took this meeting. I said, I think you've got this product. I think you've broken the code. But more importantly, I think that Yahoo or Microsoft's going to offer $1 billion, and everybody you know is going to tell you to take the money, and I think that would be nuts. Anyway, what followed was hilarious. I described the whole thing in my book. But the long story short was that was exactly why he was there, and before he'd said a word, I described the exact scenario. And I explained to him how to prevent the deal from going through, and so in that sense, it's my fault. And then my role with him was to help him rebuild the management team, and for that I brought in Sheryl Sandberg. So I'm to blame for that too. I stopped being an advisor in 2009 when Mark told me he was determined to get to 1 billion users, and I said, Mark, the only way you can do that is by doing business in countries that are authoritarian or with advertisers who are unethical, like scammers. I can't be part of that. I feel really bad about what's happened. I don't have regrets because I don't think that's useful, but I've spent 5 years trying to fix a thing that I was involved in its early days.
And that's why you're going to continue doing it, I get the sense.
I don't know if it's why I continue to do it. I think I continue to do it because I believe in democracy and I believe in the right of
Can
self-determination.
I ask a really big question at the end? We've got 10 seconds. COP26 is happening. Climate change, the crisis depends on human behavior changing and government action. Are you more hopeful that governments and consumers will change their behavior with technology or with the climate?
I don't know. Today, it doesn't look like we're going to change it for anything, and I think that's really the test, okay? Are we able to actually think about the future in real time? And the answer, I hope, is yes. And I just want to say thank you for humoring me. Thank you for listening to this. We have a big challenge, but we can do this. We really can.
And
our ancestors did it. We can do it too.
I'd
okay?
like to say thank you and a big hand for Roger McNamee.